Starting to see everyone trickle in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Lunch and Learn, or I suppose Dinner and Learn, brought to you by the Models and Resources Committee of Archivists Religious Collection Section of SAA. As our disclaimer here, the content in these presentations, click Enable Audio Transcription and you can see all closed captioning. There will be a question and answer period after the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We are not going to be using the chat or unmute attendees, so that's just to keep things moving in terms of time. Please be respectful and follow the SAA Code of Conduct. This session is going to be recorded for your and others' later use. We do ask that you please fill out the survey afterward, and please consider joining SAA if you are not a member. The raise hand feature, well, we do not need to worry about the raise hand feature. Please use the Q&A for all chats. Our speaker tonight is coming from the traditional homeland of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway nations. We'd like to thank those nations for their care and concern for the land. They have been around for thousands of years, and we continue to be around today because of their stewardship of the land. Tonight, our speaker is Sara Ludewig. She's an archivist with the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. She holds a Master's of Library and Information Science and a Master's of Arts in History from the University of Maryland at College Park. Her interests include oral history, social justice and archives, Catholic women's history, and the history of peace movements during the Vietnam War. Her article, In the Habit of Resistance, Radical Peace Activism and the Maryland Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, 1968 to present, can be found in the spring 2022 edition of the Journal of American Catholic Studies. Sara, you've done this talk once before. Thank you for giving it again, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Scott. Give me a second here. I'm gonna share my very groovy 1970s slides. Okay, I think that should be okay, and you should all be able to see the slides. Okay. Thank you all so much for attending today, and thanks so much to the committee for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to be here with you all today to talk about Catholic nuns and social justice, particularly how archives and archivists can support research. Today, I will present an overview of the peace activism of the Maryland Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, talk about the archives I consulted and my research methods, and then I'll close with some reflections on how archives support research before taking questions from the audience. So my research was conducted for a master's thesis at the University of Maryland, College Park, and my advisor was Dr. Robin Munsey. My project was entitled In the Habit of Resistance, Radical Peace Activism and the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur from 1954 to present, and it has since been published in an article form in the Journal of American Catholic Studies. And the main questions I asked were, how did the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, who also go by the SNDN as their abbreviation, so you'll hear me throughout refer to them as the SNDN as well as the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. But how did the SNDN come to be involved in peace activism? How was this activism informed by their identity as Catholic sisters who were part of a larger community of like-minded women? And how did this identity shape their participation in peace movements in ways that differed from male peace activists? I'm not going to answer all of these questions for you tonight. You'll have to go and read the article or my thesis for that. But I'm going to try and highlight the peace actions of 8 of these sisters during the Vietnam War today. So, between 1968 and 1972, members of the Catholic left, a loosely organized religious coalition that fought for peace and justice in American society, took nonviolent direct action in at least 53 separate draft board raids across the United States. One of the first raids occurred in 1968 when a group called the Catonsville Nine removed draft files from the Selective Service Office in Catonsville, Maryland, torched them in the parking lot with homemade napalm, and then calmly prayed while they awaited arrest. This event triggered a series of Catholic draft board actions across the United States with the participation of over 200 priests, lay people, and sisters, including many members of the Maryland province of Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. Individuals in the Catholic left anchored their actions in their Catholic faith, arguing that their actions stemmed from a denouncement of the materialism, racism, and militarism of American society. Activists adopted an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist ideology and targeted the war in Vietnam as the manifestation of violent systems of racism and capitalism in American society. Connecting this radical ideology with Catholic teachings about the sanctity of life, they took nonviolent, direct action against the United States in an effort to alleviate human suffering. However, activist religious sisters from the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, in addition to asserting their Catholic identity in their peace activism, also added a gendered identity to these religious justifications for peace. The sisters centered their identity not just as Catholics, but as Catholic religious sisters, using this distinct identity to shape both the rationale and form of their actions for peace, and drawing on their religious community of women to sustain their activism. Activist sisters justified their peace work through an identification with the teachings of the Catholic Church and a philosophy of peace and justice linked to the specific beliefs and mission of their religious community. Mary Kane, one of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, remembered the trial of the Catonsville Nine in October 1968 as her initiation into Catholic peace activism. She attended the hearing at the request of another sister who did not want to attend alone. Speaking of members of the Catonsville group, she recalled, quote, "We heard Mary Moylan and David Darst. We heard them testify. I was just so impressed by these people, the clarity of vision and the ability to express where they stood," end quote. This moment proved crucial to Mary Kane's involvement in the Catholic left, and she credited her awakening to other people. In particular, she remembered her sisters as central to her engagement with peace, saying of the sister who took her to the Catonsville trial, quote, "I have always been very grateful to that sister," end quote. Mary's introduction to the peace movement demonstrates the centrality of the community of Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur to the peace witness of individual activist sisters. Sisters like Mary were introduced to the peace movement through fellow sisters and then continued their activism based on their own individual convictions. After the trial, Mary began work with the Catonsville 9 Milwaukee 14 Defense Committee. She used her faith to justify her work, explicitly connecting her explanations for joining the peace movement with the teachings of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur as a religious order. In a letter to her Maryland Province sisters in October 1969, Mary explained that she was leaving her teaching position to work full-time for the Defense Committee. She wrote of her work with the Defense Committee as the, quote, "logical extension," end quote, of her previous work as a religious sister whose, quote, "ministry of reconciliation as Sisters of Notre Dame includes concrete efforts toward racial and social integration and promotion of a world vision of international peace and unity," end quote. She went on to stress the importance of work for both peace and justice, arguing that the Defense Committee made, quote, "a significant contribution to the Institute, the Church, and society," end quote. To Mary, working for peace meant working for social justice, and these two ideals were intimately tied with her work and calling as an SNDN. It was precisely her identity as a religious sister, specifically as an SNDN, that compelled her to claim peace as her vocation. Through her work with the Defense Committee, Mary was introduced to direct action against the draft. She remembered that after Catonsville, the Catholic left, quote, "had these things called retreats, which I discovered were recruiting sessions that you could get invited to in New York. So when I was invited, I went," end quote. Recruited because of her political and religious convictions for peace, in 1969, Mary became an active member of the Catholic left. Mary Kane, Beverly Bell, Susan Davis, and Marjorie Schumann were all heavily involved in the draft board raids of the Catholic left. To conduct raids, peace activists cased selective service offices and hid in the building during operating hours. At night, the activists left their hiding spots and then removed and destroyed draft files. And they destroyed them in all different kinds of ways. Sometimes they poured fake blood on them. Sometimes they burnt them. Other times they went to protest and handed them out to people. And sometimes they even sent them back to the person who had signed up for the draft. But the action of destroying draft files had both concrete and symbolic significance. It clogged the bureaucratic processes of the Selective Service and prevented the conscription of men with high draft numbers. But it also represented a radical position against a state that the activists viewed as morally corrupt. By destroying government property, these activists protested the state's perpetuation of the war in Vietnam. They argued the state's imperialist violence, and not the destruction of government property, was the true detriment to society. Mary Kane was active in draft raids in New York City and Boston in 1969, and subsequent raids in Philadelphia and Delaware in 1970. Sisters Beverly Bell and Marjorie Schumann both participated in a draft raid in New Haven, Connecticut in 1970. And Sister Susan Davis was a member of a Catholic organization called the East Coast Conspiracy to Save Lives, which destroyed draft records in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. The sisters participating in draft board action between 1968 and 1972 drew on the larger SNDN religious community for both material and spiritual support. And Sister Sarah Fahey really exemplifies the type of support the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, as a community of women religious, provided their peace activist sisters. In 1969, Sister Sarah was pursuing a PhD in sociology at Temple University in Philadelphia. While at Temple, Sister Sarah provided critical support for Mary Kane during her participation in selective service raids in Philly and in nearby Wilmington, Delaware. Mary remembered, quote, "Sarah, when it was time to go into the Philadelphia draft boards, gave me a home so that I could be there," end quote. In addition to providing a living space, Sister Sarah allowed activists to plan draft board raids at her home, living upstairs with Mary, but devoting the first floor to peace activity. While activists cased selective service offices for the raid, someone tipped off the police, who arrested and beat one of the male activists. After police busted the raiders, Sister Sarah bailed out imprisoned activists and dealt with an FBI raid at her house. Despite intimidation, surveillance, and violence against peace activists, Sister Sarah chose to participate in the Catholic peace movement through her trusted connections in the SNDN. She offered material support to the movement by giving her home as an organizing space and contributing bail money. The draft actions of the SNDN and their allies, conducted in disparate locations across the East Coast, culminated in the 1972 conspiracy trial of a group nicknamed the Harrisburg Seven. You might have also heard of this group as the Harrisburg Six or the Harrisburg Eight because the number of defendants kept shifting, but I'll refer to them as the Harrisburg Seven because that's the bulk of the trial. They were seven indicted. So the Harrisburg Seven, in January 1971, a grand jury indicted 6 individuals from the Catholic left for an alleged plot to kidnap National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and to blow up the heating systems of federal buildings in Washington, D.C. The group included Fathers Philip Berrigan, Joseph Wenderoth, and Neil McLaughlin, Sister Elizabeth McAllister, who was a member of the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, Anthony Skoblik, and Ekbal Ahmad, who was a non-Catholic. This group of priests, women religious, Catholic lay people, and non-Catholics faced trial for federal conspiracy charges. At the time of the indictment, the grand jury named both Sister Beverly Bell and Marjorie Schumann from the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, along with 4 other individuals, as unindicted co-conspirators in the trial. Even though there were no legal repercussions for unindicted co-conspirators, these individuals were associated with the alleged plot, subjected to public scrutiny, and called to testify in the trial. In April 1971, the grand jury indicted Mary Kane of this SNDN and Ted Glick as additional conspirators. Early in 1972, the Justice Department also named Sister Susan Davis of the SNDN as an unindicted co-conspirator in the trial. So a lot of involvement from the SNDN in this Harrisburg 7 trial. And the trial called witnesses from the Catholic left across the East Coast. The federal grand jury investigating the alleged conspiracy subpoenaed Sister Sarah Fahey to testify, along with Sister Beverly, Sister Susan, and Marjorie Schumann. These women refused to testify, though, against their sister and the other activists. By refusing to testify, these sisters turned the trial into a site of political protest and risked jail time for contempt of court. The indicted conspirators also used tactics to shift focus and turn the trial into an arena of political protest against the war in Vietnam. All 7 individuals, including Mary Kane, refused to plead to the charges against them, and instead issued statements asserting the charges were, quote, designed to stifle opposition to the Vietnam War, end quote. Thus, the trial of the Harrisburg 7 became an arena of peace protest for activist members of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. And Sister Sarah, in particular, leveraged her refusal to testify as an act of protest motivated by her understanding of her religious community. In a statement prepared for the press, she linked her decision not to testify to the specific religious calling of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. The first sentence of her statement centered her identity as an SNDN, whose, quote, special concern historically has been the poor in the most abandoned places, end quote. Speaking of her calling as an SNDN, she wrote, quote, my own experience and the reevaluation of the meaning of religious life within my order have convinced me that the most effective way for me to manifest this concern is through work for peace, end quote. Citing these reasons, she refused to testify in front of the grand jury. In deciding not to testify, Sister Sarah drew attention to the religious identity of the SNDN as central to her conviction and peace activism. In doing so, she created new opportunities for acts of political protest during the legal proceedings in Harrisburg. And then the last act of peace protest that happened during the Vietnam War that I'll talk about today is a series of pray-ins at the White House that were conducted by the SNDN. At 9 o'clock in the morning on July 6, 1973, 4 Catholic religious sisters joined the line for a public tour of the White House. The sisters, dressed in casual clothes, easily blended in with the tourists clamoring to see the antiques decorating President Richard Nixon's White House. 25 minutes after the house opened, sisters Catherine Kaur, Beverly Bell, Sita Lam, and Judith LaFemina, all members of the SNDN, stepped out of the tour line, moved aside the velvet rope, and knelt on the rug in the White House main hall. One sister calmly announced, quote, we are here to pray that the bombing in Cambodia will stop, end quote. She invited the tour group to join them before launching into the Lord's Prayer. Arrested for unlawful entry, the 4 sisters, all members of the Maryland province of SNDN, had just triggered 37 days of pray-ins at the White House to protest the bombing of Cambodia. Their protest attracted the attention of the Community for Creative Nonviolence and the Catholic Peace Fellowship, and activists from these groups flocked to DC to join the protests. Over the course of the summer, police arrested nearly 100 individuals, both Catholic and non-Catholic, for praying at the White House, all started by these 4 sisters in early July. The sisters also continued their peace activism after all US troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1975. So their commitment to peace was not confined to the Vietnam War. It lasted their entire life. They saw peace as an end to all suffering and deprivation, not just as an end to war, and as a result worked towards this longer goal. And they really believed that war was linked to larger sufferings in society, and that if they alleviated some of these other sufferings in society, the causes of war would diminish. And just as examples of this, we have Sister Catherine Kaur, who held several leadership positions in Jobs with Peace and the Save Our Cities March in the 1980s and 1990s in Baltimore. And through her leadership, she also encouraged other sisters in the SNDN to be quite active in this organization. And you can see her on the slide on the far right, marching in the Save Our Cities March in 1991. And Mary Kane was, and still is, in fact, she's in her mid to late 80s and she's still active for peace. But she is an organizer with Women in Black, which is a peace group that meets in Baltimore. And the sisters as a group also continued their ministry to the poor and their work to end some of this larger suffering in society that they believe caused war through the establishment of the Julie Community Center in Baltimore that had some pretty radical economic programs to assist the needy in the 1980s and the 1990s. But we're here today to talk about archives, not just about the end results of archival research. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research process. I conducted research during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. My thesis process lasted from January 2020 to May 2021. So this really limited my ability to access archives. And so I had to get really creative about how I accessed primary sources. But some of the key archival resources that I used in my project were the Catholic News Archive, which is a text searchable database of US Catholic newspapers from 1831 to present. All of these have been digitized and are searchable online from across the United States. So I was able to see newspapers from Philadelphia, from California, from Minnesota, all these different places. And this is actually how I first came across the activism of the SNDN. What really sparked my interest in these women and their activist history. There was a digitized article in the Catholic Worker newspaper, and it mentioned 4 sisters who had been arrested at the White House for praying. It didn't name any of them by name, and so I had to, from there, trace back and find these sisters and other archival sources. And I really, through this one instance, uncovered this larger treasure trove of activism and involvement with peace from these sisters. I also consulted the University of Notre Dame archives, namely the Catholic Peace Fellowship records. I worked with the archivist over Zoom to view these records. University of Notre Dame charges for scans, and I was a poor grad student and wasn't prepared to spend a lot of money on scans. So the archivist very kindly set up an appointment with me where he pulled a bunch of boxes that I thought I might be interested in, and he sorted through them and said, oh, I don't really think this is what you're interested in, or oh, like he'd hold things up and be like, oh, what about this? To make sure he was scanning the right things, which was very kind of him. I consulted as well the Trinity Washington University archives. Trinity Washington University is a Washington, D.C. college that was founded by the SNDN in 1897. And there I worked with the sister archivist, Mary Hayes, to get materials scanned. They're a fairly small institution and they lack the resources to fully scan materials. So I know that there are more materials there that I need to see, and that the pandemic, as well as the resource constraints of the institution, limited what I saw from that archive. But I was really grateful to Sister Mary for getting me those materials. And then finally, I consulted the Swarthmore Peace Collection, and they were able to as well digitize materials that I needed to consult. So really, I'm very grateful to all of these archivists and institutions that I worked with to get materials at that point in time. So at this point in my research process, I have newspaper accounts, I have copies of the prayers that were used at the pray-ins by the sisters, I have photos of the sisters, some of which you've seen here today, I have letters written by the sisters, I have assorted publicity materials and organizing documents. And I've learned the stories of Sister Rosalie Murphy, Sister Susan Davis, Beverly Bell, Sarah Fahey, and Marjorie Schumann. But even after all that, I still felt like there was a crucial part of the story that was missing, that I was just not getting the full story. So I turned to oral history. And through oral history, I learned the stories in depth of Sisters Mary Kane, Mary Hayes, and Catherine Core. I ended up conducting 4 virtual interviews with Mary Kane and 1 interview each with Mary Hayes and Catherine Core. And I did all of these over Zoom because of the pandemic or over the phone. And it was really the women-centered network and community of the sisters that I ended up studying and using in my thesis that allowed me to conduct these oral histories with these women. The sisters connected me with each other. They would be like, oh, you really should talk to so-and-so. Have you reached out to this person? And really connected me with their sisters. So what I ended up doing is I had my Zoom phone call or my Zoom call or my phone call with the sister, and I had formulated a list of 15 questions to ask participants. But what ended up happening instead was that these sisters had spent a great deal of time contemplating their life experiences and trying to make meaning of it. And so their story came out in narrative form, and very little prompting was required from me. So I mostly ended up just asking follow-up questions and clarifying certain points because the story came out of these women in such a narrative form. Participants also signed an oral history release, allowing me to use their interview in my academic work. And then I recorded the interviews, I transcribed them, and I used the quotes in my written work. So that's all that is included in my work, but what's not included? I know there are gaps in what I was able to consult. What's not included is official diocesan archives. The Baltimore Diocesan Archive was reluctant to scan material for me, and they remained closed during my research period due to the pandemic. So often when I do a presentation like this, I get a question about what the response of the bishops or the Catholic hierarchy or the diocese was to the sisters' actions. And I have some of that from newspaper accounts and the accounts of the sisters themselves, but it would be nice to have a more official perspective from the Baltimore diocese, seeing what their official documents might say, but I wasn't able to access those materials. I also know there are more extensive materials from Trinity Washington University archives, but they remained closed due to the pandemic, and the volume of materials was just too high for the limited staff at their institution to scan. There was a prayer and study group that was devoted to peace that met at Trinity Washington University that I would have loved to have seen their records, but I just wasn't able to access these due to the constraints of the pandemic. So that's an avenue for future research. And then finally, there were previously existing oral history collections that I was unable to access. In 1992, Sister Mary Riley conducted oral histories with the Maryland Province SNDN in celebration of the Order's 150th anniversary in the United States. Unfortunately, these oral histories are saved in the SNDN regional archive under a highly restrictive access policy that prevented me from viewing these collections. And I'll talk about that more later on in my presentation.
Sarah, can I have you stop for a second? Can you unplug your microphone and plug it back in? You seem to dropped out there.
Presentation. Can you hear me okay, Scott?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. And you can see the screen still?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. I'm having some Zoom difficulties today. So I don't know what you all heard, but I was talking about previous existing oral history collections conducted by Mary Riley in celebration of the Order's 150th anniversary in the United States, and the highly restrictive access policy that prevented me from viewing these collections. And I'll talk more about that restrictive policy later. But instead, I used excerpts from the interviews that were published in a book that the Order created called Women of Courage. So I didn't get to access those raw oral history materials, the transcripts or the recordings. So I used these excerpts, which is not ideal to be pulling a primary source from a secondary source, but I had to do what I had to do. And I can talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so a few key takeaways about how archives can support historical research on the social justice activism of religious sisters. One big takeaway for me was digitization. Digitization enabled me to access disparate collections. I could see things from Pennsylvania, Washington, DC, Indiana, Ohio, numerous other locations, all without ever leaving my home. And digitization is really important as COVID-19 continues to restrict access to collections. The pandemic also created a lot of opportunities for us to creatively use technology to assist researchers. Big shout out to the archivist at the University of Notre Dame who used Zoom to show me materials, which is very labor intensive. And the pandemic also built more flexibility into workflows that were previously quite rigid. But all of that work that goes into digitization comes with the caveat that we need to ensure that funding and our labor force enables this important work. So it's a trade-off. It's also best practice in the field if we want to ensure that the stories of these incredible women are widely shared. Oh, I'm having Zoom problems again. Okay. Can you hear me okay, Scott? Sorry. Okay, so sorry. Having Zoom problems. Okay. So I was talking about digitization and needing to ensure that we have both funding and labor force to support some of that work in the field. But it's really important that we share the incredible stories of these women, and digitization is a tool that enables us to do so. Another thought I had about all of this during my research was archival processing and description. I think we really need to think critically about how women are represented and described in our archival practice. The stories of these women were not neatly filed under the Sister Mary Cain papers. Rather, they were found through careful digging in the Catholic Peace Fellowship records or the Religious Orders printed materials papers. Catholic women religious are currently often invisible in our archival description. And there are additional complications of the multiple names for Catholic sisters before and after Vatican II. Sisters are identified by multiple names in the records. So an example of this is Sister Catherine Coeur was Sister Thomas Mary before Vatican II. And then after Vatican II, she switched to using her given name again. And then there's an added complication with her in that she went by the nickname Sissy. So there were 3 names to look her up by. So a lot of sifting through the records using different search terms. So finding some ways to standardize that would be helpful. And I know that inclusive description is an ongoing conversation that many of us as archivists are having at our institutions. And I don't think I have any easy solutions for you all. But I did want to offer up a few questions to ask ourselves as we think about how we describe women religious in our collections. And those are, how can we enhance our archival description of records in a way that highlights the work of these women? What type of language are we using to describe the actions of women? Are we using active or passive language when talking about them in our records? Are women obscured by the prominence of men in the Catholic Church's hierarchy in our descriptive practices? And how can we account for changes to names and practices in religious life, both before and after Vatican II in our descriptive work? And this is something, we're here to talk about Catholic nuns today, but this is something that's not just applicable to Catholic women religious. This is also a conversation to be had around religion more generally. And an example of that in more general religion comes from the American Folklife Center, where I currently work as an archivist. I just processed the Linda Lamacchia collection, and she studied Buddhist nuns in India. And I ran into similar problems with the different names, spellings, and identifiers for the Buddhist nuns, or Jomos as they're called, in India. So a larger conversation to be had among archivists for a religious collection. But inclusive description is an important conversation for archivists to be having. And then finally, my last takeaway is about oral history and access. During my research process, there were oral histories that I wanted to conduct with a few key sisters, Sister Sarah Fahey chief among them, but I was unable to due to lapsing memories, health concerns, and issues with technology. But I found that sisters were really eager to engage and to share their stories. I barely had to ask questions. The stories flowed from these women almost without prompting. And the oral histories that I did conduct proved to be the backbone of my research and also provided this history with a compelling and relatable sense of warmth and humanity that would not have been possible through only traditional archival sources. So a big takeaway for me was that it's imperative that archivists of religious collections work to collect the stories of these sisters before it's too late. I wasn't able to do a lot of interviews because of memory issues, because of technology concerns, and those are only increasing as time goes on. Another takeaway is about access to these collections. Restrictions on collections in general exist to protect the privacy of individuals and their sensitive documents. However, I think there is such a thing as too much or unnecessary restriction. And an example of this is the restriction on the 1992 oral histories of the SNDN that I talked about earlier. Oral history is not only an act of collection, it's also an act of collaboration, one that requires radical listening and empathy. And you can ethically collect oral histories and work closely with the oral history participants without fully restricting their access for future researchers. In 1992, Sister Mary Riley wrote that she hoped that, quote, rather than hiding the light of so many sisters' lives under the bushel basket of anonymity, they should shine for all to see, end quote. But the oral histories she conducted are available only for internal researchers or for immediate family members to view. So if you're a diocesan official, you can go and look at these oral histories, or if you are immediately related to one of the sisters. Even though some of the same sisters were very willing to speak with me and have their interviews publicly available. My key point here is that oral history was crucial to me telling the stories of the social justice activism of the SNDN. And as archivists, we need to first work to collect these stories, and in the process of collecting them, work to ensure that if the participants are willing, these stories can be accessed by researchers. And this might look like working closely with participants to determine comfort levels, negotiating rights and restrictions before the interview process begins, or offering to pull the plug on the whole project or restrict certain parts of an interview as needed. But it should not look like a blanket statement that restricts all oral histories, even if the participant is comfortable with their work being shared. It's a delicate and complicated balance to strike, excuse me, and one that puts the onus for sensitivity and collaboration on the archivist, which is where that onus should be. But this is work that archivists need to put in, as archives exist not merely to keep and preserve, but also to share these stories. Before I take questions, I'll close with some reflections on archives, oral history, and the activism of Catholic nuns. On October 14th, 2020, I came to the end of my last formal interview with Mary Kane. I asked her if she had any parting thoughts before we hung up the phone, and she replied, quote, I wrote this down to say to you, I need to see my successors coming along, and I'm convinced that you're one of them, end quote. I was stunned and honored. How could I, a non-Catholic graduate student, be considered the successor to a Catholic sister who burned draft files? As I mulled this over, I was struck by what Mary's comment tells us about the significance of the Maryland Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur's peace activism and the practice of women's history, oral history, and the work of an archivist. Over the years, countless journalists interviewed Mary, eager to hear about the Berrigan brothers or learn sordid details about Mary's marriage to a former priest after she left religious life. But no one asked her about her identity as a religious sister, her daring actions for peace, or her cherished community of like-minded women. In the 1990s, when Sister Mary Riley did ask these questions, they were locked away in an archive to be viewed only by other sisters or diocesan officials. Listening to the stories of these sisters has power. Their oral histories tell us not just that sisters existed in a history that seeks to ignore them, but also that the presence of religious sisters in peace organizing impacted the form, content, and longevity of Catholic peace activism. The sisters are eager to pass the torch to a new generation of women activists, and for Catholics and non-Catholics alike to understand the gravity and legacy of their work. They also reveal the wide range of women active for peace and the different ideologies and perspectives that compose 20th century women's peace movements. These women help us understand how social change actually happens. Social change is not achieved through consensus. Instead, it is messy and fragmented and manifests as different groups working toward various goals related to the same issue. As we continue to work for a more peaceful and just society, historians need to ensure we write histories reflecting the true diversity, complicated methods, and political aims of women's movements for peace. In order to write at the true diversity and complexity of these movements, archivists need to do the important work of including these voices in their archives. The peace activism of the SNDN is just the tip of the iceberg. Other scholars like Shannon Williams, Kathleen Sparrows-Cummings, Amy Collinger, and countless others are doing important work on the social justice activism of religious sisters. And we, as archivists, have a lot to contribute to this process. According to Mary Kane, we are her successors, following in her footsteps and working to ensure that the history of Catholic nuns' work for peace and justice is not forgotten. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I guess we will move on to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That is, there's a lot to take in there, and I definitely have some thoughts as it affects my work for sure. We do have a few questions that came in. First one is, did any military Catholic chaplains engage with the SNDM protests? And I suppose that means any of the Catholic left protests.
Yeah, so I don't think I can speak to the Catholic left in general because it is such a wide range of activists for such a long period of time. But I didn't come across any Catholic military chaplains in my research, but I'm sure that there were, and that might be an interesting avenue for research, especially thinking about organizations like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and if there were activists, Catholic activists involved with that organization.
This is a comment, but you might have some insight into it. Regarding the difficulty of tracking various names for sisters pre and post Vatican II, the Sisters of Providence each received a unique number upon profession. So their archive has included that bit of data attached to their name and catalog records, so they're not confused with another sister.
Awesome. That's like exactly the type of work that I'm talking about that archivists need to engage in to ensure that we don't lose these sisters through to the annals of time.
This is another archival related question rather than a history related question. What do you think is the reluctance to allow access to records besides COVID restrictions? Did you encounter different restriction with different archives, and were you ever given a reason?
Yeah, so I think that it was an interesting time to be doing research because of the COVID pandemic. So oftentimes I couldn't tell if our records were restricted because of COVID or because of actual restrictions. I think in the case of the Baltimore diocesan archives, a lot of those were restricted records and they rightfully did not want to scan them. They were things that should be viewed in the reading room only. And so they weren't able to get them to me because of the time I was searching. And then also there were probably things in there that I just, even if I showed up in person, would be unable to view. And I found that a lot of Catholic hierarchy organizations were had more restrictions on their materials. And then there was another part to that question, wasn't there, about
different access for different religious archives. And were you ever given reasons?
Yeah, so with the oral histories in particular, privacy was cited as a big concern. And I really do respect that as a concern. I want to make that clear that I'm not advocating that we shouldn't have restrictions in archives because they do serve a purpose. But I just found it really interesting that the reason these oral histories were kept behind locked doors was because of the I even asked her about it. I was like, oh, you did this oral history in 1992.
Can I pause you right there? You broke up for a second.
Oh.
That portion of your answer again.
Yeah, sorry about that. Zoom is being really glitchy. So I was talking about the 1992 oral histories and that privacy was often cited as a concern, and that I totally agree that is a valid concern. But I found that I was conducting oral histories with some of these women. So Mary Kane had a copy of an oral history in this 1992 collection. And she was totally willing to speak with me. And I even tried to ask her about it, to be like, oh, like, I noticed you did an interview in 1992, but I'm not able to access it. And she was like, oh, I don't know why you wouldn't be able to see that. I like never said that anyone couldn't see it. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. I think out of an abundance of caution, perhaps the archivist has those records restricted. So I think that's the best reason I can come up with. But I think that, like I said in my presentation, when thinking about oral histories, it's really careful and time-consuming work. You do want to make sure you're protecting the privacy of the people you're interviewing. You do want to make sure you're not sharing information that shouldn't be shared. And this requires building close relationships with your participants and working with them closely to make sure that everything you put out there is comfortable, rather than doing all this work to collect things and then just locking it all away without doing some of that more careful work and negotiation.
Yeah, there's a comment here that I suppose could be phrased as a question. This commenter has encountered a certain amount of reluctance among sisters to talk about themselves, and the belief that nobody would be particularly interested. Did you encounter anything like that at all?
Yeah, I did. So I talked about how the sisters kind of had this like life narrative ready to go. And often that life narrative would be like, oh, and then I just like, I just like started this whole like White House praying thing, but it was no big deal. Like, don't worry about it. And I was like, no, like, tell me more. Like, I need you to tell me more about why you were involved with this. Like, and so I did find that the sisters often downplayed their accomplishments. Even in their like life story, like life narrative that they had created to tell me, they were often reluctant to put themselves in the spotlight. And I think part of that is the nature of religious life, and also like that they see, and I talk about this in my thesis and my article, but these sisters see themselves not as like individuals acting for peace, but very much a part of their like sisterhood and their religious order, and that their work is an extension of their religious charism or like founding mission. And so like natural in their minds, it's like naturally I would be doing this because this is what I'm called to do by God. And so I found that reluctance as well. And so I had to be careful to ask a lot of follow-up questions to get them to share more about that.
In relation to that sisterhood, did you ever encounter any records that showed the activists consulted with their leadership before they did what they did? And did leadership ever give them any blowback?
Yeah, so I think I said this in my presentation, but I think there's a lot of research that still needs to be done here. Particularly if I could get a hold of those Baltimore diocesan records and find out some of the perspective of the male leadership. That would be really helpful in understanding some of the blowback that was coming from the Catholic Church on this. But within the Maryland province of sisters themselves, I found that the leadership was really supportive. Actually, their superior was Sister Rosalie Murphy, and she was not as actively involved in like direct action against the draft, but she was active for peace. And there is a particular example, which is that, so Beverly Bell was an unindicted Sister Beverly Bell is an unindicted co-conspirator in the Harrisburg 7 trial. And there's an interview in the Washington Post in 1971 or 1972, where Sister Rosalie Murphy, who's the superior in the Maryland province, sits down with Sister Beverly Bell for an interview and comes out in support of her actions and says, Sister Beverly Bell has not done anything wrong. We as a sisterhood are standing behind her, and we are here to support her actions. We think that she is like working in the best interests of our community. So I'm still curious, and I have a lot more research to do on how people in the Catholic hierarchy, how the bishops were reacting to this activism of the sisters. But I do know that within the province itself, leadership was very supportive of the action they were taking.
This goes back to some research methods and some archival contributions, I suppose. When you conducted the oral history interviews, did your consent forms allow for archiving, or were they for personal use only?
So I didn't have the support of an institution behind me. So yeah, I should put my money where my mouth is, but they're not for archival use currently. I could go back and talk. I've maintained my relationships with the sisters. I actually owe Mary Kane a phone call. But so I think that there is room for me to go back and speak with her and with the other sisters about this and try and find a archival repository that could be their final home. And a good oral history project has that figured out from the outset, but I was a graduate student. And so I think there is room for that to happen eventually, and for me to continue to work with those sisters to make it happen. But at the outset, it didn't get done.
Did you hear archivists speak about lack of funding and staffing leading to issues of access and researcher access?
Yeah, I mean, so in particular, as a researcher, it's interesting to be both a researcher and an archivist, right? Because you're on both sides of the coin. And so when I would ask archivists for assistance, I always did it with the understanding that I knew that they were pressed for time and resources, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, March, April, and May of 2020 were horrible times for all of us. And so I knew that people were mentally running short of resources as well as their institutions. So I went into it with that mindset. But I did hear people talk about, oh, we just can't scan this for you. We're so sorry. We don't have the staffing. We don't have the capacity on site currently. So I guess the shorter answer to that is yes.
How much impact did you find in your research on the changes of Vatican II on the activist sisters?
Yes. So if you go and read my thesis, that is a whole chapter in my thesis. The first chapter is about the sisters from 1954 to 67, 68. And it's thinking about how Vatican II enabled the sisters to participate in peace protest. Around the time of Vatican II, the sisters shifted their calling and their mission, their vocation away from teaching, which they had traditionally been, and they continue to teach. But they started to shift away from teaching towards thinking about education and towards thinking about their founding charism, as Vatican II called them to do. And their founding charism was helping the poor in the most abandoned places. Because of Vatican II, they started to work with the poor, particularly in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore. And through this work with the poor, they became involved with the civil rights movement. And their civil rights movement activism spiraled into their peace activism in the late 60s, early 70s. So there's a much longer history here. And I viewed Vatican II as kind of the tipping point that pushed the sisters into this type of work, which you can read more about in my thesis.
And there is another comment here. This is from a lay archivist, lay professional archivist. As archives of women religious collections become increasingly staffed by professionals, we are able to encourage leadership to re-examine and reevaluate restrictions that now seem overly strict. And I'm quoting directly, so thank you for encouraging me to continue to examine these previously established access restrictions.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad to hear it. I'll be visiting those archives when those restrictions lift.
That is the end of the question list that have come in, so we can give it a minute if people want to type one more question, get one more chance to figure out any burning urges here. But unless one of those falls in here, you definitely gave me a lot to think about, and I would very much like to promote the materials that are in the collections that I look over that relate to some of these topics. Beyond that, I hope that everyone in attendance here will join us for our next chat, which I believe is on I unfortunately do not have the date in front of me. Feel free to watch the SAA boards for when the next chat will be happening. It will be more likely during the day than during the evening. But thank you very much for spending this dinner and learn with us and at this strange time. And Sarah, thanks for giving this presentation one more time.
Thank you all so much for attending. I appreciate it.